Good evening, everybody. First, I want to say thanks. Thanks for taking the time to see us. We're going to be talking today about an opportunity in what I think we all know as the Southern Gateway part of town. It's a larger pieces of land, about 60 acres, a part of which CLMP is a tenant of. And of late, there's been some interest in looking at what some of those opportunities are. And what we're going to do today is sort of bring you through a presentation that's going to probably last, hopefully, 15 to 20 minutes. Part of this presentation is geared toward the PAD zoning process. We are looking at potentially establishing a PAD zone in this site, and as part of that process, it requires, wisely, that we give an informal presentation to zoning, and in this case, a joint meeting between the zoning board and, again, wisely so, the design review board. As part of this process, as we go through this presentation, we urge that you ask any questions, any concerns that you have. We've got a fairly thorough analysis. We understand the issues. Now, the team assigned or commissioned to do this consists of me. I'm Chris Ferrero, and I'm a vice president with Fuss & O'Neill. But prior to that, I spent 25 years here in Simsbury as Ferrero Hicks & Associates, landscape architects and planners. So we're not only very familiar with the site, but we're very familiar with the town as well. Bill Kroski of Kroski Architects, again, not unfamiliar to this town, has done a lot of work in town, particularly with respect to the historic preservation aspects of his work. Craig Seymour of RKG Associates is here, and Craig will discuss market and development as it relates to marketability. That's basically his business, and he'll get into that a little bit more. Robin Pearson, who's going to be a little late, but I think she'll be coming, will be representing the legal component of the team, which obviously for an informal hearing we're not really dealing with today. The developer is Garden Homes, and Garden Homes is interested in a component of this larger mixed-use development. They're interested in the residential component. They're not new to this business. They were established in 1955. They manage, sell, build over 80,000 units between for sale, rental, all different types of housing, elderly housing, family housing, housing for millennials. This is a group that's got horsepower. They've already, in the past, shown a commitment to Connecticut. They've got established Connecticut projects, Hamden, Manchester, Windsor, Bloomfield, and they've taken, quite frankly, an extreme interest in Simsbury. So we know the site. The site is basically 60 acres between Route 10 and 202 and the bike trail. Now, this is, as everybody knows through the multiple studies that have been done on this project, this is a mixed-use, I guess, neighborhood, let's call it, for lack of a better term. So there's office, there's retail, the Avon Town Line, of course, just over the Avon Town Line, there's a pretty successful, continuing to be pretty successful retail mixed-use development. And two of the key factors with respect to A, Garden Homes' interest in this development, and B, some of the initiatives in Simsbury are two things. One is we are enamored with the relationship of that bicycle trail and how it connects all of the various components, not only to downtown Simsbury, but downtown Avon, the mixed-use office areas, and then directly across from that bike trail, the Nod Brook Wildlife Sanctuary. These are important elements for a developer to get involved. It creates uniqueness, it differentiates this type of a project from potentially other projects. So again, this particular site in this particular area of Simsbury has certainly not been unstudied. There's been a lot of study here. The POCD specifically supports mixed use in this area and goes so far as to establish desirable performance objectives, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we talk about the design. Incentive housing zone study done fairly recently, a few years ago. Basically, this site was a Tier 1 priority to be designated as an incentive housing zone. As part of that incentive housing zone, recommended mixed use with approximately 250 units of supported mixed types of housing. Fussell O'Neill basically did the Route 10 corridor study, so we're very, very familiar with the character issues associated with two things. One is the continued view to those ridgetops into the Hugh Blind Tower, and two, to maintain the two-lane character of Hop Meadow Street through the area. And what I will say, as part of even previous applications for this site, Fussell O'Neill was involved in the infrastructure, stormwater management, and traffic and transportation aspect of that. So we have a lot of data. In fact, we had our traffic engineers, for example, crunch some of the data and indicated that from a traffic generation standpoint, it would generate approximately half of the volume that was associated with that previous application a number of years ago. That previous application was still able to, within reason, maintain, depending on definition, a two-lane road, but clearly, and it would be studied further as we get into the pad application process, but clearly the traffic impacts are substantially less and the two-lane character would surely be maintained. POC goes as far as creating fundamental tenets for this particular site. I mentioned a couple of them: preserve views, the open space along Hop Meadow Street, a part of an open space to be preserved to try to symbolize the character of those what are now fundamentally open farm fields, and then access to the recreational areas, which I mentioned prior. So a little bit about the analysis. We're very careful about how we place buildings on this site and where these buildings go and what density looks like on this site to try to maintain the character of those tenants, those tenants for the site. What this shows is these are view cross sections through the property and then up to the ridge line, the Tucka Mountain ridge line. And they're taken in a number of different areas. And these little enlargements, although difficult to see, talk about a one-story pitched roof building, two-story and three-story, and where they would need to be placed on the site so that you actually, from a view from Hop Meadow Street, see over the roofs of those buildings and still get a view of that ridge top. Now, that's not to say that there might not be some buildings blocking some parts of it, but the idea of this design and the planning process is to basically try to maximize the view to those ridgetops. This is the resultant analysis from those cross sections, and what these sort of pastel shaded areas are is the front of this right here is where a one-story building with a pitched roof could be located and you'd still be able to see the ridge line. The next layer, sort of yellow ochre, is where a two-story building would be able to be placed and still see the ridge line. Similarly, this point, three-story, and then at this point, we just put this on for illustration purposes, that is a three-story building and you'd still see 200 to 300 vertical feet of the top of that ridge. So what does this do? Initially, when Garden Homes came to us, this was the site that they wanted to look at. After we performed this analysis, it was very clear that any type of density, vertical density, in this site would have some substantive impacts to the views to those mountainsides. We basically suggested that they look at this site right here, because as you can see, as this site drops off and as it has a lot of depth to it compared to the northern site, that the impact to views from rooftops, even at 3 stories, is almost non-existent, and I'll show you a couple of slides that illustrate that in a built form in Avon. What I'm going to go through fairly quickly here is a series of slides almost in movie form. You see the little red dot in the sort of in the lower, that's going to move. We're going to sort of go down the street, traveling south first, and show you the views into this site, and then we're going to kind of do the same thing traveling north. And what I want to point out is a few things. One is that it's winter, so we don't have leaves on the trees. The second is that I think you're going to be surprised at how little of this mountain you actually see. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, a lot of which pertain to landscape that pertain to the ability to see or not see the mountain at any given point. So right here, we're basically at the entrance to the office complex. I'm sorry, my pointer's going in and out here. We move forward, the red dot moves to the south, and this could be could be a pastoral, beautiful view to the mountains, but we of course have all that existing vegetation along that bike trail, and we have existing vegetation near the CL&P site, again a tenant of the property. We continue to move forward. We have some wow, that's much better. As we move forward, there's a lot of existing scrub vegetation, which I think, my guess is as part of any application would probably be cleaned up. But there's a lot of scrub vegetation along the side of the road between Hot Meadow Street and the property. A good example of this is almost at the CLMP property line. We're right here. Of course, that's the CLMP building. Again, CLMP, which currently is the only developed tenant on the overall 60 acres. Similarly, there's where we start to get some of the best views. These are, I think, are some of the more iconic views to the mountaintops. These are the views that during the design process we really tried to appreciate and to design for. But one of the things in this picture I wanted you to note, and I'm glad Hiram turned off the lights because we wouldn't have been able to see it otherwise, is that building. That's the office building in Avon. That's a 3-story building, obviously far back in the site. But what you can start to begin to see is that 2- and 3-story buildings that far back in the site, from a view to the mountaintop standpoint, won't have a substantive impact to that view. Again, still traveling to the south. Now what we see here, down in this picture, that's wetlands. So that is well-established vegetation that, frankly, we're not going to be able to remove. And that is going to, in perpetuity, create a visual block to the mountainside. So again, we plan for that as well. There's that vegetative wetland area, and the reason we now direct this into the site like this is because when we get to our proposal, what you're going to see is that we're actually going to remove some of that to basically create a terminal view from the street directly to the mountains. So that will actually be enhanced. Approximately this much of that would be gone as part of the proposal. Again, adjacent Avon office space. This is, I believe, a 3-story building on that office site, much closer to the road. So you can see the roof peak relative to the mountain in the background. Now we're turning around. Continuing now north. Again, so there's one of those iconic views. There's the tower, right? These are the views that we're really looking to preserve and to enhance. We continue, and again, once again, we get to CLMP, and frankly, this was the day of landscape design where pine trees were the savior of every landscape architect who needed to put them around every building to buffer every land use. But pine trees grow, and in this case, they've grown potentially to the detriment of view sheds. Similar? Again, this is that site. This is the northerly piece. Again, a pretty good view to the tower and to the mountain ridge. Scrub vegetation, cube line tower, panoramic view. And we're almost back to where we started. So these blue areas really are those dominant existing views that you have. And again, there's a lot of scrub vegetation along Hot Meadow Street. There's a lot of vegetation on the CLMP property. There's vegetation that will not be removed as part of the wetland. And then, of course, there's existing vegetation along the trail. So how does this relate to our development concept? The development concept revolves around a couple things. Open space connectivity, both in the front and the rear of the property. And by connectivity, I mean basically establishing a large green space between Hot Meadow Street and wherever development or pavement would occur, as the POCD suggests. Linking that directly to the bike trail and to the wildlife area through a system of open spaces and green spaces that basically create terminal views from the existing streets all the way to the mountains. Now the data, so far, this is a concept plan, so this may or may not change a little bit as we move forward in the process. What I consider the front parcel here consists, at least current planning, is potentially 2 subdividable sites, approximately 67,000 square feet of mixed use. Again, mix of 1- and 2-story buildings. Our analysis tells us that putting 2-story buildings here is not a problem because you're buffered by that vegetation in the back anyway, but that these would be limited to the 1-story. Now, the northerly parcel, which we had originally suggested, is basically approximately 88,000 square feet of mixed use. Again, this is approximately a 40,000 square foot, single-story building, and these would be, I believe this one's two-story because it's set back in the site. This would be one-story, again, to preserve at least those views over that peak. Now, CLMP is a tenant of the property, and that comprises about 49,000 square feet of existing office space and about 15,000 square feet of industrial, which then leads us to the component of the housing component of this mixed-use facility, which would occur in this area here. And that, again, current thinking is that this would be comprised of 181 units, and that's a mix of housing types. Fundamentally, about 150 to 160 apartments and 25 plus or minus townhouses. The concept with building breakdown is the same. The smaller townhouses, the two-story product goes up front, sort of toward Hot Meadow Street. The higher density three-story is in the back, which is completely almost contrary to the way you might start looking at developing this site, i.e. putting the density on Hot Meadow. The density is going to and relating to and will be used by the bike trail. Again, the bike trail is an important component of this process. So we've actually been involved in a number of the projects that have been approved recently in town, particularly residential projects. So we understand the market aspects of what we're talking about here, and Craig Seymour from RKG will come up and talk to you a little bit about that.
Great, thank you, Chris. Again, Craig Seymour, I'm Managing Principal with RKG Associates. We are too familiar with Simsbury, having worked here a few years ago on a question with the Simsbury Airport. What we were asked to do on this is to do an assessment of the potential demand for residential housing, of rental housing in particular, in Simsbury. And our conclusions, as you can see there, is we estimate there's a demand for around 175 units annually over the next 5 years based upon population projections. And remember, what the demand for housing comes from really two different areas. One is increase in population and increase in number of households and the changing demographics within that, as well as it's income related in terms of the types of housing that people are going to be looking for. In the Hartford market, which we looked at Hartford County as the larger market area, over the next 5 years, there's about 8,000 new households are going to be generated or be created, both from the creation of new households as well as from the growth of the people that, the population that's here, people moving in as well as the organic growth that's here. That's split down, at least based on historic trends, to be about 2,000, about 25% of that household growth is going to be rental housing. Now, I say, based on historic trends, what we're seeing in the market today is an inflection in the traditional mix between single-family housing and rental housing, and part of that is the demographics. Much of the demand, about 60 to 65% of the demand for rental housing is coming from people under the age of 35 or households that are aged 55 or more, empty nesters, essentially. It is also a relatively high income market, and with those with 80% of the total demand for new housing and rental housing is coming from households with greater than $60,000 a year in today's dollars annual income. What that leaves us is, when we do this analysis, is a range of about 190 to 230 units total of a potential capture rate. And to get that, we looked at the county market and then looked at historic trends of where capture has taken place by sector within that market. And this particular market area north of downtown Hartford that takes into West Hartford, the Avon, Simsbury area is, and a Farmington area is one of the fastest growing and most desirable areas. And so you'd be a development here is able to capture a relatively fair share of that market. Competitive market rates, which we looked at, that could be supported in this area, run from $1,600 a month for one bedrooms to $2,100 a month. That is to capture that market, generally earning more than $60,000 in household income. We do know that there's 370 units currently in the planning stages, either approved or under construction here in Simsbury, which is a lot for a town like Simsbury. But when you compare that to the potential capture in this area and the potential demand, you're talking about 2 years supply is available now. and that demand is going to continue to grow over a period of time. One of the reasons, and particularly in this location, where the capture rate in terms of being able to attract people to this market within those demographic segments, is the location. Being on the southern end of town and being adjacent to Avon Center is a very attractive location because of the walkability, because of the bikeability, and some of the other features that it has. That is another factor that brings into, it's taken into the elements of that. So,
You want us to hold questions or ask them?
What do you guys think? I mean, I guess it doesn't matter to me. Go ahead, ask away.
Just tell me with the math back on that last slide. If there's only 40 new units annually in 5 years, why is that not 200 new units instead of, and with 370 being built? I'm confused. If there's churn of 130 to make up the 175, you don't need to build 5 times 175 units annually.
no, what it is demand for housing comes from both the demand for new housing, new construction, as well as turnover of existing housing stock in the marketplace. What would happen if there's a new apartment or a new multifamily housing project here, it's going to capture a fair share of its demand for new construction, new households coming in looking at new construction, but it's also going to capture a fair share of the demand from people who currently live within the market in existing multifamily housing, and capture that because it's new, it's more desirable, and in a good location. So you take in order to estimate this, you capture your demand.
So the 130 units is from other people living in town, not from moving in?
Yes. Will be moving out. And new people moving in would be, well, not necessarily new people moving in. The 40 new units annually is the amount of demand based upon the forecast of housing construction, multifamily housing construction within the Hartford market. So it's going to capture a portion of that. And again, these are trends that have been forecast based on population growth or household growth. And the other units is going to come from, instead of people, the growth is going to come to town. People are going to move to Hartford, or people are going to move out of their parents' house, and they graduate from college, they come in and they're looking for an apartment. They may move into a downtown apartment. Someone in that downtown apartment may very well be at an income level, they'll move into a new apartment. That's where that growth is, a combination of those two. We've also done a preliminary assessment of the commercial market, because this is a mixed-use project, and looked at some of the potential retail opportunities. As you know, retail demand follows households. It goes where the population and the incomes are. The incomes are here, the households are growing, and as a result, there is some niches in the market for various commercial activities. One is in the grocery or specialty food. As you know, south of here in Avon, there is an awful lot of retail, fairly close, for your big box, for your large grocery stores and those types of things. But we feel that there's the potential demand for for smaller, more localized grocery type activities, smaller stores such as a Trader Joe's or some of the many farm-to-table stores that are coming up, as well as specialty markets like fish and wine and cheese. And they're also looking at and what we do is compare demand based upon income levels, household income levels, with the amount of square footage that's available now, to look at if this area, and Simsbury in particular, is capturing a share of that. There also is a retail gap in the home furnishings and home improvements area. And again, based upon the analysis of the market, that is more on the smaller level of a restoration hardware. It's actually right in the middle of a big gap in New England where there isn't a restoration hardware right now. And flooring and tile stores, which are appealing to those empty nesters that, instead of downsizing, are doing like I am doing and putting all new windows and siding on my 35-year-old house, because some of us don't like to move out of our big houses. Also, neighborhood convenience center with retail, restaurants, coffee shops, and a lot of personal services, dining, bakeries, office supplies, those types of things. That's going to, the demand isn't going to come overnight. It's going to, fill in after the residential activity is established and as the households grow. But there is demand for that, in my opinion anyway, to support the kind of mixed-use proposal that you're looking at now.
But the proposal you have right now is strictly for residential. Your proposal has nothing to do with commercial. In those two plot plans, there was nothing there with stores or
Yeah, there
wine
is.
shops.
There is.
There is?
Yeah.
Want to go back to
Now-
that?
Yeah, part of the PAD application, PAD requires mixed use. Part of the zone requires mixed use. So our proposal, the zone change, the nature of the zone change is you would be zone changing for a mixed-use project that it contains commercial, that contains residential, that contains mixed use. The component that would be built first is the residential component. Thanks, Craig. So good. Great question, Tony. So that's a good segue. I mentioned earlier that the Plan of Conservation and Development talks about desirable performance objectives. So I want to talk a little bit about how this concept, and it is a concept, so again, we're here today to garner information from this group, but this is a concept of mixed use whereby your mixed use components, your larger building footprints, if you will, although lower roof pitches, for the reasons I stated before, occur toward Hot Meadow Street. These are mixed-use components that probably would be comprised of some of the things that Craig Seymour talked about, and in particular in the two-story buildings, the second floors would potentially be comprised of additional residential units or office space as market demand required. Clearly, the 14-acre piece of land, which is under option currently by Garden Homes, is a residential component. So these performance objectives, we talked about some of them already, preserving the views and the vistas and the open space character, so you can start to see how we're looking at these terminal views and how we're looking at open space, both in the front and what's not shown in this graphic, but the Nodbrook Wildlife Area to the rear, as kind of that connectivity with the bike trail, providing the accessibility and multimodal opportunities to Simsbury, to Avon, to whatever happens at the Hartford and anything along those lines, farther north, farther south. The variety of housing options we've talked about, in particular the scale of the housing options. The idea is that the smaller scale buildings are located sort of closer to the Hot Meadow Street, and the larger 2.5 to 3-story buildings would be grouped along that bicycle trail, again, bringing the density of human beings, if you will, the closer to that trail to maximize the opportunity for that trail's use. Again, to continue, yep, sure, Tony.
To the right.
Yep.
To the right, that's Avon, and that's the office buildings in Avon, right?
To the left is actually Avon.
Oh, yeah, to the left, I'm sorry.
Yes, right. So the office buildings are right here.
Okay.
So part of that, what did I do here? Okay. Yep. So continue with desirable performance. Access management. So Fuss and O'Neill was part of the Route 10 corridor study, and access management on this parcel is a huge thing. The access management here is basically 3 primary entrance points, one of which is existing. Also, there's an existing access easement in favor of these adjacent properties. So we would really be utilizing the existing CL&P driveway to access substantive portions of this, therefore minimizing the curb cuts along Hot Meadow Street and really allowing us to sort of accentuate that, what amounts to, football-sized meadows in the front yard of these buildings. So part of what this PAD zone does is it, to some extent, establishes the design controls for the housing part of the development, which would be occurring, of course, in the near term, but also for the mixed use and commercial development that would be occurring in the longer term. So we're establishing, as part of this process, the scale. We're establishing the density, we're establishing parking, general layouts, and satisfying the tenants and the desirable performance objectives with the Plan of Conservation and Development. So we also know, as part of this, our involvement with the site, that this is sand and gravel, which makes this ripe for green infrastructure. So the ability to detain stormwater and infiltrate stormwater on the site is the best it could possibly be. So the way the site plan is basically laid out is it's a common spine, and the common spine is really devoted to streetscape and is devoted to what we call the public realm. The parking areas are concentrated in the rears, And in each case, the open space at the rears of the building are very, very large greens that would be specifically for green infrastructure. Now, continuing with sort of the green infrastructure concept, this is an existing wetland. That's an existing right-to-drain easement from the CLMP tenant to that spot. This is a very low-value, quite frankly, meaningless wetland that we would be disturbing in order to remove the vegetation that I talked about before, open up the terminal view, and then create basically new wetlands with lower vegetation in a wetland mitigation area, again, fronting on Hot Meadow Street. So in general, that's the sort of level of activity that we'd be proposing here. We talked about the ability of keeping Hot Meadow Street as a 2-lane road, which is very important to the town. It's important to us, and it's achievable in this plan. And lastly, the importance of that bike trail. I mean, Connecticut's the only bike-friendly community. I mean, Simsbury is the only bike-friendly community in Connecticut. And I mean, in my personal opinion, this particular type of project, which is with its emphasis on that, really supports the notion in that initiative. We are not quite sure what architecture is going to look like yet, but Bill Krosky has done a lot of work in town and out of town. His specialty is housing. His specialty is historic preservation. He worked on Eno Hall with me a number of years ago. This is just a smattering of the potential different housing types, from the sort of low-density townhouse, which is in the more of the front of the project that we talked about, to a little bit of the higher density. This would be 2.5 stories to 3-story type units. The project will have a clubhouse facility in the center green, if you recall. That center green is right here, so it's a 1-story building, so it doesn't block any views. That clubhouse will have probably a swimming pool, and there'll be bike storage facilities and potentially even zip bike programs down toward the bike trail. Again, not getting into too much detail with architecture yet. As we come back as part of an official application for the pad zone change, clearly we'd have site-specific and project-specific architecture for you to show and for you to comment on. So with that, I mean, that's really the
One more?
Yep.
question. To the left again, in Avon, where there's the office park, and then right next to the office park
Yep.
is Riverdale Farm, I think
Yep.
it's called?
Yep.
With health clubs.
Yep.
Wine stores, plumbers, all those sort of things which you were talking about are going to be in this development in the front, those type of stores. The competition is such that you think you can still, and this is a euphemism, draw a crowd when that's just 100 yards away?
I mean, Craig can stand up and address this. I'll stand up. I'll address it as a non-market person.
At this moment, we're not saying that there's demand at this moment for it, but as the region grows and as Simsbury grows and as Avon continues to grow, there is an increasing demand for those kinds of retail and service activities. What's happened, there's a shift in the marketplace that people are much prefer to go to smaller local places where they don't have to jump in a car, fight through 6 lanes of traffic to go to a big box store. They'll still do that for certain things, but there is an increasing trend now towards support for smaller local businesses.
So that's...
Would you go back to the master? Now, if I understand you correctly, the right hand or the left hand side of this is residential, correct? All
half of it,
residential.
yeah, 14 acres right here.
All right, and the right hand side, is that residential also?
No.
Okay, well,
It
let's
may-
go, let me go back to the left side.
Mhm.
How many units? I don't need the answers. One drives the other. The number of units of residence, the number of cars, therefore the number of asphalt.
Mhm.
Now, I know this is a concept,
Mhm.
but I'm looking at the concept and I'm seeing if I understand it correctly, there's a great deal of asphalt.
We're going to be parking approximately 300 cars.
As we go forward, we're going to be hard on that question.
Mhm.
Because I understand that we need circulation, we need the space and pavement for emergency vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. But what is almost demanded today in development, and certainly development of this property, is very clever use of asphalt or whatever, blacktop, concrete. And to me, if the streets you show in white are pavement, then you're showing me a lot of pavement on the left-hand side of that plan.
On this side.
And as we go forward, I want you to think about that, and I also want you to be prepared to justify the square footage.
We will certainly be prepared to do that. What I
Sorry, I
can,
didn't hear it.
Hiram, isn't impervious cover considered in the current zoning?
yes, and I failed to mention that. Each one of these 3 sites is under 50% covered.
Yeah.
Very low coverage. Very, very low coverage.
Does the LMP stay in its current form?
For the time being, yes.
There's no parking garages or anything in there?
There's no parking garages. Nope.
But there's garages underneath the buildings?
No, there's not. There's not garages under the building. This is surface parking. And the clever part of handling surface parking in this particular scheme is that we're minimizing the large surface lots. So these 2 lots are the biggest parking lots we have, and they're not that big. And the reason is because we're using the street circulation system to support visitor parking. So the street circulation system is going to have diagonal parking. The streets are going to be dual use. And that was in order to try to get rid of the big expansive seas of asphalt and to try to help us maintain these open spaces, which are the back doors and the green infrastructure stormwater management components of the project. But if you look at the site from an overall perspective, because of initiatives like leaving these big green swaths, this is a football field and a half size open space. So those kinds of things reduce coverage to below that 50% that we're looking to achieve here. Yeah.
Just one other question back on the main slide. So the development above the residential is office space, retail space?
This would be probably ground floor retail service. And then these, for example, are 2-story. So above that would be office or residential, depending on what the market would bear. These are 1-story simply because of that view shed analysis that suggested we want to still see the mountaintops, over those buildings. Before I leave this slide, is there another question on this slide? Okay.
Wait.
Oh,
Can I ask you a question?
sure.
Can you tell me how wide the buffer is?
This buffer,
10?
I think it's about 120 feet, something like
Okay,
that.
and the height of the one-story building?
I believe I tagged them at 12 at about 17, 18 feet.
Including the roof.
Pitched roof. Yep.
Question.
Yes.
Can you talk about the CLMP property just a little bit? It just seems like it's stuck right in the middle of 2 potentially nice complexes. If you had
Thank
your
you
way,
for the compliment.
Well, no, if you had your way, right, and you were going to do 2 of the 3 sectors there, what would be the 2 ideal ones? Are we stuck with CLMP right in the middle of that because, we don't want to tear it down, it takes too much, it's too much work, effort?
Well, honestly, CLMP is 50,000 square feet of tax base. I mean, that's a business.
Right.
It's been in Simsbury for a long time. I would imagine it's going to be in Simsbury for a while longer. And, my take on this when the client commissioned us was that's part of mixed use. I mean, that's part of why this particular, that piece is part of the plan. Because it lends the office to the mixed use.
Chris, could you comment on that, along with that, Juan's question? In terms of the NU piece, is it the laydown yard in the back there, is it all used? Is it sparsely used? Is there room for anything else back there besides the yard that's there?
What we're showing here, Hiram, is a couple things. We're showing future connectivity through these pieces so that these pieces are all interconnected without having to go back on Hot Meadow Street, both on the west side and on the east side. Now, their laydown yard, we have not looked at the efficiency of that. We've not looked at how that works. I think it's going to be up to the landowner and my client to determine how far we delve into that CLMP situation and what we can or can't do moving forward and make commitments as part of the pad application. Yes.
Just out of curiosity, are the mixed-use portions of the development built at the same time as the residential, even though the market demand may or may not be there?
No.
Or how does that work?
The residential component is built first. And, well, what my next slide gets to is, and we'll get to the next slide, is the process that we're going through, in other words, the pad, zone, application, and approval is going to lock in the standards for the development of the future development of this property. Second is that 181 units will be built adjacent to this future development. That's a catalyst. So that helps spur the rest of it. And I would venture to say that part of the reason there's been almost no interest in this parcel until now is that there's too many unknowns. So we know what happened to the last application, and we don't know what the town wants for character. We don't know what they want for scale. So what we're doing is we're establishing that for everything as part of this process. And as part of that process, we build that catalyst residential component first. And again, Craig and I both tend to agree that this stuff is relatively soon to follow.
Just a comment, I guess. You know, the CL&P building, although I have problems with CL&P for all sorts of reasons, but not their building, it's not a bad-looking factory.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's far enough back from the road.
Yeah.
And enough, you know, those pine trees and all that sort of stuff. It looked attractive. Part of, you know, my thought process, strictly from a design standpoint for the architect, use some of this, and CL&P's yellow brick, I think, most of it, right?
Yeah.
You know, make it somehow match
Tie
or
it
fit
in.
into the stuff you're doing.
It's a good comment. Yep. That's a good comment. I'm changing slides, going once. Okay.
There's garages underneath those buildings, by the way, that you just showed us.
Well, there are. They're not actually underneath the buildings. They're on the side, Tony.
Okay.
Let's not mix it. Okay, so we talked about garden homes. The landowner here went through a process of selecting a preferred developer. Garden Homes is not the first group to come to see them about this. I guess they had a number of them, and they went through a process and selected Garden Homes because of, A, Garden Homes' commitment to Connecticut and Simsbury, their clear capacity, I mean, 80,000 units since 1955, and their commitment to quality. We just talked about sort of the first phase as being the catalyst to potentially the rest of it, and the pad zone process really takes away some of the unknowns by setting the character preferences of the site as we move into the future. Supports the bike-friendly community, of course. We're placing a lot of emphasis on the relationship of that bike trail to help reduce congestion to people who want to take the 15-minute bike ride to Simsbury restaurants and then bike home instead of driving into town to do that. It's completely consistent with POCD and other area studies, and of course, it's probably half of the scale of previous applications. So this is part of an informal process. The dialogue that ensues today, or the questions or comments, help us to decide whether we're to move forward with an actual PAD zone change process, and so we welcome those comments and advice at this time.
Could you just go back to the very first slide?
I'm glad you didn't ask for the master plan slide. Yeah. Let's see, there's got to be a... What is it? Okay. I don't know, if somebody who knows computers better than I knows the better way to get...
Click the bottom left.
Okay, tell me when to stop.
Very first one.
That one.
Yep.
Okay.
No need to take
Rob,
notes.
smile.
You know, the concept of starting something there is good. Otherwise, it's going to sit there
Yeah, that's the point.
as a weed field forever and a day.
That's the point.
And starting at that south end, adjacent to Avon, you know, I hate to say it, but it sort of connects it to Avon. So there's a continuum, and not just something sort of sitting out in the middle of a field by itself. I know someone else on Hot Meadow put some apartments recently that's sitting out in the field, and I know he's having a hard time marketing those. So you market, unfortunately, with Avon, but the concept of starting and then moving north, you got to start someplace. As long as you meet all our stuff in the guide.
Is that the end of your presentation?
That is.
Okay. Questions or
Yes,
comments?
questions, comments, absolutely.
So, Jen, you want to, we're not obliged to give them feedback, but it's helpful if we do. That's why we go through this process.
Correct.
Yep.
I think I appreciate Tony's comments.
I agree, and I'm sorry, I don't, Vaughn. I agree with Vaughn. It's too bad that CL&P property on the master plan, it looks so much nicer on either end than you have a big building and a parking lot in the middle. It's just too bad. Can't possibly do something with that.
That's my, understand tax implications. And I
Yeah,
agree with
look,
that.
looking at
They
the,
have a long-term lease though, right? They just signed
Yeah,
another
it's-
long-term lease, right? I think so. Yeah. So it's not an option.
it's too bad.
There to stay, yeah.
They're a fantastic taxpayer. They keep
Just
37
wondering,
truckers.
what was the reason behind having all the units, rental units versus single family or?
I think that's proving out to what the market is bearing right now. The condominium market, for example, we were just involved with Mill Crossing, and it's crystal clear nationwide that the rental market is the financeable and marketable component of housing at this point, far, far, far and away, and that condominium is, quite frankly, very much the opposite. So Garden Homes will manage this property and manage these units for a long, long time. However, if the market changes and the financing community changes, in particular those townhouses, those become potentially condominiumized in the future.
Is all of that, those 3 parcels under one ownership?
Yes.
Who is the principal?
Mr. Greenberg is here. I can't remember the name of the company, but Mark Greenberg.
Okay.
How you doing?
Good. There's got to be somebody somewhere.
Yeah.
Both these boards have spent a great deal of time looking at these 60 acres. From my point of view, what we're looking at now, I think, is has much more potential. It seems to meet a great deal of what we're looking for in this community now, and in the near future. If we don't have too much asphalt.
So I'll speak, I'm Rob Pomeroy, Chairman of the Zoning Commission, and we have 3 or 4 of our members here today, that from our perspective, the concept when we originally approved the PAD was that you would do exactly what you've done, which is to bring forward ideas, informally get feedback, and then try to use that process collaboratively towards something that we all like and be proud of from both the owner and the developer's perspective, but from protecting the character of the town. So this is a good first step. I would also agree that the combination of residential and what I call sort of medium range or light retail and commercial is really a good one for this area of town. My biggest concern with these phased projects is that we get enough definition in the rest of the properties. And we understand that you need to have somebody sort of sign up and start, and it's residential, but we will be most interested in having as much definition as you can to the rest of the parcels when we look to approve the PAD with a reasonable amount of flexibility in terms of which buildings are retail or commercial or residential, but with a great hope that the whole thing gets built, because we do think that that's what you're asking us to approve going forward. So
To Rob's point too, on the retail, I don't know if there's any studies out there that will tell us, once you build the retail portion, what's the lagging time frame for retail to come in before the
We
Once we build the residential.
Yeah, sorry, residential and then retail. Because we keep hearing about this. Everyone's telling us this, and it's a little soon to tell yet, but we've got a lot of residential being built. We've got some commercial stuff, and they keep telling us the retail's coming, and we're not seeing it yet. Maybe we will, but is there any studies around that?
I mean, I'll be honest with you, and Craig and I have had this discussion before. 200 units of housing is not going to create retail. Okay, that's not the kind of input it's going to help. You need, if it's pure housing units, retail requires a whole bunch of things. Drive-by traffic volumes, right? How many rooftops within a given area, and it's a lot. But there is, I mean, you can talk about the area and Avon and Simsbury and what's currently not being served, and guarantee that even the idea of putting shovels in the ground shows progress on a piece of property. And we've seen that time and time again. We've seen it right here in West Simsbury at the Commons, right? You put the shovel in the ground, things start to happen. Now, we can't guarantee that, but we can tell you you're a lot better off getting that retail with the residential component going in first than without it.
And Chris, just to add to that, development of real estate is obviously a risky business, and how you can quantify to the extent you can and control that risk is what attracts investors into that business. The residential and the multifamily in particular now is the lowest risk, relatively lowest risk type of development, because one, you can get bank financing for it and do it all out of your own pocket. But once they see a development going into the ground that has a defined plan with it, that says you can do this here by basically walking into these boards and saying, we're following the plan, here's what it's going to do, here's what we're going to put in there, and get that sign off and that approval without having to go through that long-term process, makes us a very attractive site for that next real estate investor who's going to come along, the developer who has the retailers in his pocket or the ability to go get those retailers and bring them in. This is going to be a much more attractive site than trying to do it from scratch in today's market, which isn't going to happen.
Can we get back to that slide that nobody wanted to let go, the one with the three
I gotta
portions?
go all the way to the end again. Any more questions on this slide?
Put the arrow at the bottom left. That's what the area is.
One of the things that might,
Oh, rats.
Sorry, I'll go back and click on the,
Okay.
Just leave it like that.
or just go straight down, there's that little,
one of the concerns I might have, I think John brought it up too, about too much, we don't know because it's not a detailed drawing, but too many impervious surfaces. And the thing that might concern me is that nice green strip that goes all the way through the three pieces of property. And seems to me, I can recall that when there was another application some time ago, all of a sudden that setback shrunk. And the next thing we knew that the cars were literally on top of Hot Meadow Street. So how sacrosanct is that, whatever it is, 50 feet or so, that doesn't also become impervious surfaces if this layout doesn't provide enough parking spaces, if you
Well,
will.
it provides enough parking spaces. I can tell you that right now. We're at a level of detail that is a concept level. The next level of detail would be when we submit for an actual pad application. Now, that still will be concept, but it'll be tightened up. And at that point, I don't anticipate that shrinking at all. And also at that point, whatever gets approved out of that pad process, we're pretty much locked into. So we won't be able to turn that to impervious surface later.
Your master plan shows Blue Ridge Drive about twice as big as Lincoln Lane. Is that part of your,
No.
you have to widen it?
Those are right-of-ways, so those are actually 50 feet property lines versus the road width, which is probably only 24 to 26 feet.
Okay.
And another question on this slide, is that's old metal plane?
Yep.
Is it lined up with the
Yep.
entrance? And it's signalized?
Yep.
You're not anticipating a signal at,
I don't know, I
Blue
talked
Ridge.
to my traffic guys about that, and they're unclear whether we have the volumes to get that signal or not.
we want a signal on every street corner on Route 10, that's our goal. We're getting very close on our
Run
way.
again next year, do you?
Well, the big thing, I think, is...
I'm kidding everybody.
There's clearly maintaining two-lane character of Hot Meadows is paramount to the town. You can play games with that, and the games have to do with how long your turning lanes are. A long turning lane can feel an awful lot like a three-lane road. So the idea that this is literally a little more than half of the volume generated versus the previous application, and understanding where we were with the previous application leads me to believe that we're probably in a pretty good place with respect to that. Again, more detail to follow as part of the application process.
If I were Avon, I'd be happy with this. Because
Avon's
when you
gonna
get
have
on
to
that
be happy.
bicycle path, it's going to be easier to go to Maximia than it is to go to Metro Bis.
Right.
So they're going to head south.
Tony, we can't move the southern part of town to the middle of
Why
town.
not?
We just can't do that.
Yeah, well, have you tried?
Yep.
I have a couple of questions. Being that I work on the plan of development, I think there's a little poetic license that's been taken up in some of this. One is the second tier of the plan of development was for mixed use. The first tier was for
Office.
industrial, yeah. But the second piece of this is that we spent a lot of time dealing with the front for the green space. It's much larger than what you have. And the other part of it
Did you
is
actually
this-
determine how large that should be? I didn't
I'd
read
have to
anything
go
where
back
there's
and
actually
look.
dimensional criteria or,
We went through because we went through and we put in specifics that could be
do you go through the
calculated
cross
out.
sections and figuring out where the buildings need to be relative to being able to see the mountains to determine how wide that?
Well, because of the fact that there was an election run against me on it and I won, I'm pretty clear on the scenic vistas. And I know that front is gonna block the scenic vista. And I know that you use the word, okay, so some of them you'll see. But the whole point of it is to be able to see all of it. So from the whole entire strip going down, and I noticed that in some of your pictures, you were like in the driveway. You have to be on the road. So if you really put your car on the road and drive by, you're gonna get different than when you're on the property and taking the photographs. And then there was one other.
Should I answer that one first? So the way I did this without getting hit was I was on the pavement of the road and I was taking 60-degree shots, which is basically the limit of your eye as it drives. That's how much you can eke your head before it gets dangerous. That's where those shots were taken. Now this site, at that road edge, drops immediately about 5 feet. From the road down, it drops down 5 feet. Unlike this side, by the way, which is relatively level. Then the site continues to drop backwards. So that's why, quite frankly, that those cross-section analysis were really important to us as part of that design process to try to stay with the intent of what the Plan of Conservation and Development was trying to tell us. In other words, keep that ridge open. And the Plan of Conservation and Development specifically says, if I'm not incorrect, that it's not intended to have an unobstructed view along the whole ridge line, but that we have to take into consideration keeping those view corridors and those terminal vistas, which they point out as sort of the primary criteria.
That's kind of interpretation. But we have big discussions on that. And the other piece of it is that when you pointed to the 3-story building in Avon Meadow, that's significantly lower than this piece. So I think when you're looking at that one, and you're looking at 3 stories on a higher, when your grade is going higher, I think you gotta really realize that it's a completely different animal. And the other piece of this is, and this is the big hotbed with the PED being the, as I call it, the perfect girlfriend, because it's what you want it to be at the time. You can apply for a PED for this, and you can change it 100 times. So there's no surety to the residents who pay all the taxes in town, the bulk of the taxes, more than the industrial does, that this is really going to happen. So once you get a PED, it can be whatever you want it to be. So the problem is that there's no insurance for the residents to be sure of what's really going to happen on this.
I mean, I can let Hiram address that, but my understanding is that once you receive
Well, ask what's her face down the street, who's come back in here a gazillion times for changes. Everything's been changed and different. I mean, from what it was initially proposed to now, it's completely different. So it's kind of, that's the problem without putting in the insurance for the residents to know and the surety what was in the PAD. And that's what I'm saying to all of you guys who are on all the boards.
And this is for the residents along Lincoln Lane along there, not for the rest of the residents of Simsbury. Because I go down that road and I really very seldom look up at the ridgeline. So it's not a big deal for me. And I suspect it's not a big deal for most residents. Those that are up there at Lincoln Lane like to look out there, but hey,
I'm somewhere in between here, but people actually pose for their wedding pictures on Route 10 with that as a backdrop. So I think it's important to a lot of people.
And we have
I've gone
quarter-
by
in
and
our
seen
quarters
artists
there.
painting. So I think it's important to a lot of people.
Is there a, not big on numbers, it sounds like I am, but if you were to look at that right now, what percent of, do you have a view of that? And then, according to your plan, what percent will have the view in the vistas? Are we giving anything up, are we gaining anything? Because right now, if you go there, I mean, you can't see the mountain from every spot. There's just,
You can't see the mountain from most
From a
spots.
lot of the
That's
spots.
the grim
Yeah.
reality. You can't see
I
the
agree.
mountain from most spots.
I agree.
The spots that you can see it from, though, we're trying to ensure that you have an uninterrupted of the top of the ridge line. But from that top of the ridge line, and maybe even 100 feet below the top of the ridge line, below that view will change a little bit. But what we're trying to do is keep the lower hanging buildings in the front and put the taller ones in the back that won't have that kind of an impact. Now, the office building that you refer to that's at a different elevation, it's actually pretty close to the same, and we'll verify that as part of the process, and maybe it's 5 feet, 10 feet different, but that far away, and given that much mountain that you're still seeing above that roof, if it's 10 feet higher, it's gonna be a blip. It's gonna be a blip visually. But the intent of this is that you maintain the views of the majority of the mountains that you have today. And maybe even with some tweaking of other property areas, we can modify landscape and even enhance some of that.
So the mountain is about 600-700.
700 feet, yeah. Yep.
Just wanted to address the design review board. Anthony, your comment, you're the design review board. Your comment about only the people on Lincoln Lane care about what they see is a preposterous thing for somebody who serves on the design board, review board to say. You're supposed to care about design, aesthetics.
I am. I care about what's in our guidelines. And I told
Correct.
us we follow our
Correct.
guidelines.
But
But the young lady back there said that everyone's worried about that.
Down a road, when the whole concept is to preserve a vista, is not consistent with the mission of what I think somebody who sits on the design review board should do.
Or did I apologize?
Okay, so we appreciate very much I'll speak for the zoning commission.
Thank you. You can, go ahead.
I'm very big on timelines, but no, we appreciate your efforts. I think you've gotten some feedback from both the design perspective and the zoning perspective. Generally receptive of you moving forward. This is a process that does require approval by your elected officials on the zoning and design review board, and we do take seriously what we approve. And if it changes, it needs to be reapproved or not, because we take that into consideration all along. One last comment from me. I would be very interested in as much detail marketing information you have about the housing market, and would be interested because it is so close to Avon, other projects underway there, just so that we know that you guys know. I mean, you're taking the risk, you're putting the financing into it, but that it does impact. We want to be sure that these get filled and that eventually it goes. But we would, I think from the zoning, certainly didn't see anything here that would say not to move forward.
Right.
Great.
John?
Okay,
Thank you.
good. Thanks for your time, everybody.
Thank you.
All right, we just need an official
Move to adjourn?
move to adjourn, please.
I move we adjourn.
So moved.
Second, all in favor?
Aye.
Meeting is adjourned.